Bible. And we have quotes like that from all of our founders and many of the nation's leaders. And so I hope you'll enjoy this and treasure this. It's a great, great pocket constitution. We are so grateful you are joining us for the Centennial Institute's 9/11 20th anniversary remembrance. I was a college student on September 11th, 2001, and I remember the fear and horror of watching the events unfold on this day 20 years ago. I would then have good childhood and college friends that went on to serve our country by fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. To our students in the room, and it's so great to have so many of you here with us, thank you. You are now at the age where the events that take place on the national stage will directly affect your life. I'm very grateful that you're joining us this morning to reflect on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and to discuss the future of Afghanistan and the Middle East's impact on the world. Our Master of Ceremony today is Centennial Institute Director of Research, Dr. Tom Copeland. Dr. Copeland is a professor of politics at Colorado Christian University, teaching a wide range of courses in international relations and American government. Dr. Copeland formerly served as Chief of Staff in the Government Services Division of LexisNexis, working with the FBI, DEA, INS, SEC, DOJ, and TSA. It's a lot of acronyms. He is the author of Fool Me Twice, Intelligent Failure and Mass Casualty Terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Master of Ceremony today, Dr. Tom Copeland.
Well, thank you all for joining us today for this, as Jeff said, the 20th anniversary commemoration of the events of September 11, 2001. Today, we will remember. We will remember those who fell, those who survived, and those who continue to serve and sacrifice on our behalf. Some of the most powerful speeches in history were given on occasions similar to this, from Pericles' funeral oration to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. None of us claim the power of rhetoric that these two men had, but we come together now to remember nonetheless. On 9/11, 2,605 Americans and 372 non-U.S. citizens lost their lives in the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City, the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and at a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Planned by Osama bin Laden and executed by members of his al-Qaeda network, it is still the largest terrorist attack in world history. Much has happened in the 2 decades since 9/11. American soldiers, sailors, and airmen have fought not only in Afghanistan and Iraq, but in Syria, West Africa, the Philippines, and more. Bin Laden was killed, ISIS rose and fell, and now the Taliban and al-Qaeda have returned. The chaotic evacuation of Kabul airport over the past few weeks was a grim reminder that our security comes at a price. There are different views on the wisdom of America's course of action in Afghanistan, but it can safely be said that our presence there helped to reduce the threat of terrorism against not only our own country, but many others. In the latter portion of our time today, we will hear from Dr. Kiron Skinner, a professor and former public servant who will help us understand better the legacy of the Afghan war and America's role in the world. We begin, however, with praying to our sovereign God and honoring our country. So after Damon Sider leads us in an opening prayer, Rivers Nordquist will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we'll join in the national anthem led by Professor David McNeil and the Peak Harmony Vocal Ensemble of CCU.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. If you will go before the Lord with me this morning. Dear God, thank you for this day that you've allowed us to gather here. Thank you for the university that allows us to get together and have these discussions and conversations, God. We thank you for the heroes that we will honor today from September 11th, 20 years ago. We ask that you speak through Dr. Skinner today and allow us to listen well, mourn, and honor all the lives lost 20 years ago. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Would you all join me and stand as we say the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land, o'er the land, o'er the land of the free, and the home of the brave.
Lamentation is often an important part of remembering. Old Testament prophets offered up laments. The psalmist David poured out his laments in song. Psalm 137 reminds the Israelites that by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. In Matthew 23, Jesus lamented over the city of Jerusalem and their hard hearts. In that spirit of lamentation, we've asked Professor Susan Delaney Spear to share a poem with us. Professor Spear teaches English here at CCU and is a widely read poet and writer. I would encourage you to find her poetry and enter into her marvelous world of meaning and word crafting. Professor Spear.
Thank you, Dr. Copeland, and thank you to Jeff Hunt and the Centennial Institute for making poetry an important part of this memorial. I did read just this morning that in the piles of rubble that the Twin Towers became, people who visited that site used their finger to write poetry in the ashes. So it's fitting today that we should have a poem. 9/11, a long lament. Put on sackcloth, roll in ashes, mourn as for an only son, a most bitter lamentation. Jeremiah 6:26. 8 a.m. On a rare crystal blue New York morning, a news reporter's second day on the job arrives at her desk 2 hours early. 8:46. American Airlines Flight 11 hits the North Tower. The fledgling reporter kicks off her high heels and runs barefoot through the gridlock of people and cars toward the towers. Look at that. It's pieces of glass, she says. No, those flickers are people jumping, comes the answer. She tastes the ashes on her tongue. 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175 hits the South Tower. Smoke engulfs New York City. 9:05, President George W. Bush reads the pet goat to students in Florida. Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispers to him, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." The president continues to read rather than alarm the children. In Windsor, Ontario, a man flips on the TV. He sees people fall to their death in real time. He sobs and sobs. He tastes ashes on his tongue. 9:28, United Airlines Flight 93 is hijacked. In San Diego, a father walks his tearful son to the middle school bus stop. They had visited the World Trade Center 5 months earlier on family vacation. The boy tastes ashes on his tongue. 9:37, American Airlines Flight 77 hits the western face of the Pentagon. A violent fire ignites. 9:59, the South Tower implodes. A reporter stares at one tower shining through white haze. A man in Brooklyn Heights watches the tower collapse on his TV screen. 1 or 2 seconds pass. The sound roars across the East River, and he hears it in real time. He steps outside. A plume of smoke obscures the Brooklyn Bridge. He tastes the ashes on his tongue. 10:03, after passengers fight back, Flight 93 crashes in a field in Pennsylvania. Within the hour, in a suburban high school outside Denver, the children and stepchildren of the co-pilot of Flight 93 are ushered to the office in silence and in tears. A teacher watches the coverage in the classroom with her students. The footage shows people falling out of the windows from 50 stories up, and people on the ground with faces covered in ash, staring up in disbelief. They taste the ashes on their tongue. 10:28, the North Tower implodes. A reporter feels the tumbling of the floors pancaking beneath her feet. She runs right out of her shoes. "I'm not dressed for war," she says. It is like walking on the moon. Things land softly all around. Thud, 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 because of all the dust. She tastes ashes on her tongue. 12:30. A young woman's drive home to Bronxville from New Jersey is like no other. No speeding. All drivers are as polite as possible. The George Washington Bridge is closed. She drives home to where she hugs her children, 7, 5, and 3. They pray for Manhattan with the taste of ashes on their tongues. Who can stop watching the planes hit the World Trade Center over and over? The 2 towers collapsing, the people jumping, the smoke and ash that fill the screen again and again. 20 years out, we tell this story for a generation who hadn't yet been born. This long lament. We still taste the ashes on our tongues. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Susan. What a powerful, powerful lament. Those of us who saw it are still remembering. It's at times like this that we need some additional words. Dr. Don Sweeting has been CCU's president since 2016, and along with being an academic leader and a scholar, he's an ordained minister, and for nearly 25 years, he was a full-time pastor and shepherd. We've asked Dr. Sweeting to offer a few of the insights that he has shared with individuals, families, and congregations in times of grief and loss and memory. Dr. Sweeting.
In September of 2001, I wrote over Psalm 46 in my Bible, the 911 Psalm, because I found that it speaks to us in times like this in the same way it spoke to Martin Luther when he wrote, "A mighty fortress is our God," after reflecting on this psalm. In the same way it spoke to Augustine when he wrote, "The City of God," as he reflected on the fall of Rome. It still speaks today. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning comes. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear and burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Every generation, I think, in American history, in history itself, everywhere, experiences wake-up calls. 911 was our wake-up call 20 years ago. One of the most sobering days in my lifetime, one of the darkest days in American history. It was sobering for a number of reasons, and I'd like to share those with you with a little reflection on Scripture. First reason is that it was a reality check, a massive reality check. It was a moment that was riveting, that shook everybody who saw it. We stopped, travel stopped, planes stopped flying. There was a freeze on air traffic all over the United States and all over the world. TV stations didn't know what to say. Entertainment stopped. Sports games stopped. We were all frozen. This was not a movie. It was happening. And many of the postmodern and progressive myths of our time were being hammered on in that moment as we confronted reality. We were reminded at that moment that ideas have consequences. The ideas people take into their mind shapes them to act in different ways, and it's important what you believe. We were reminded that theology matters. The press was wrong, that religion is irrelevant, that theology doesn't matter, because these individuals, al-Qaeda terrorists, who declared jihad on the United States and attacked the New York City, which is the financial capital of the United States, and Washington, which was the political capital, they were moved by ideas that were theological ideas driving them. We also were reminded that this is not the end of history. Did you realize that right before then, there were historians saying, now that communism is defeated, we're at the end of history, and liberal democracy has won the day, and we're in an era of peace. And all of a sudden, slam, history hits us in the face, and we discover we're not at the end of history. In fact, there's no vacation from history. History is so often a season of war and and distress after another season, and times of peace are rare and precious. We were reminded that we can't opt out of reality. The postmodern city, New York City, all of a sudden had to escape and move away from its radical subjectivism, where we talk about my reality and your reality, and we have to deal with the reality that we're watching on the screens. In a city that had made fun of the idea of evil, all of a sudden has on its headlines in New York City papers the next day, "We saw evil." It was a riveting moment when we were struck. And the truth of Scripture that you find in Job, that man is born into trouble as surely as the sparks fly upward, was brought to bear on everyone's mind at that time. It was a reality check. Much like happens on a small scale when a brother or sister suddenly die, or a parent is taken away, or you're in an accident, it wakes you up. Another reason why it was sobering is because it was a confrontation with death on a massive scale. We forget death too. We push it out of our minds. We medicate it away. We entertain it away. We distract ourselves so that we don't have to think of it. But at that moment, everybody in the world was glued to something that had never happened before. That is where we have live coverage of an event. Pearl Harbor wasn't live on the screens around the world. You saw it maybe days later in black and white photographs. This was live. You're watching it, and then you watch it over and over and over again, and the force of it strikes you. It couldn't be escaped. The people jumping out of the buildings, like the people falling off the planes in Afghanistan a couple weeks ago. We couldn't believe our eyes, and we realized that we are not invincible. We thought it couldn't happen here. And we think that way about death too, don't we? That we're invincible and perhaps we won't have to deal with it. But on that day, we were confronted with that reminder that again we find in Scripture, that it is appointed unto all men once to die, and after that to face the judgment. A third sobering reminder from that time is it began a season of grief, confusion, lament, and resolve that we still feel. I mean, many of us know people who died on that day. In my hometown, Wyckoff, New Jersey, where I grew up, there are memorials all over the city to the people who commuted into New York and worked in the tower, and they obviously died, and the grief was amazing. They felt like we felt, assaulted, violated. They were moved like we were moved by the people trapped in the tower and the 300-plus first responders who are rushing up the stairs to try to get them, knowing that they may not make it, and trying to rescue people, and all of a sudden it comes down on everybody. It was horrifying. There was a collective wail. That's why we still lament and remember today. And it led us to pursue those who were accountable for carrying it out and mobilizing a generation of soldiers in our longest war. But the fourth reason why I think it's sobering now and then is that it opened up in people's minds, at least for a short time, perhaps a week, to gospel realities. For a week, people were willing to listen. They wanted to make sense of it all. They were asking, is there any hope for this world? For us? For the people who fell out of the tower? It was striking that I was going about my pastoral duties. And I remember I had just taught a class at Denver Seminary in church history. I was going back to the church. I got a phone call from a member of our church who used to play for the Broncos. He was now an announcer, one of the main announcers on Denver's main sports radio station. Now, I'm not a jock. I'm an academic. I listen to sports radio, maybe a little bit. And Jim called me up. His name was Jim Ryan. He said, Don, you're my pastor. My co-host and I, there's no sports to talk about. We're talking about 9/11. We're talking about God right now. This is the day after. We're talking about God. And I'm just reading from the book of Romans on Denver's main sports radio station, and we'd like you to come on to answer questions that people have. It was extraordinary. People were thinking. For a moment, their minds were clear, and they were asking the most important questions. And for a moment, we were able to speak forth the hope of the gospel, that there is a God who made this world. He created it, and we have fallen away from him and rebelled against him, and he sent a Savior into this world named Jesus, who died on a cross so that sinners could be restored and forgiven, and he rose from the dead, and he is coming again, and he will make all things new. We were able to speak that kind of hope of the Jesus who said, I am the resurrection and the life. What I would proclaim at any funeral that I would officiate at on sports radio, it was a bizarre moment. But there is no better tool for dealing with the fear of death, the ongoing lament, the tragedies of life that we will yet deal with, and our grief and loss than the gospel of Jesus. And so today we remember 9/11 and all that it stands for, but we know there are going to be more wake-up calls. We just don't know what they will be. And so we must ask ourselves, what is our hope? What is our refuge and strength? I remember as a boy hearing somebody, speaking of poems, repeat this little ditty, and it went like this: life is short, death is sure, sin's the problem, Christ's the cure. Simple, but profound. And so in our remembering today, let's not only remember the people who died, those brave souls who courageously entered the fray and gave their lives and sacrificed their lives for others. Let's go further still and remember the reality of we are living in a broken world. And remember the one who is our refuge and strength in times of trouble, and the Son of God who came into our fray and gave himself as an atoning sacrifice for our sins and rose again that we might have eternal life.
Thank you, Dr. Sweeting. Well, today we also remember those who have served our country and our communities over the past 20 years. More than 800,000 servicemen and women have rotated through Afghanistan. Some 2,400 of them, along with 3,600 contractors and 1,100 NATO allies, gave their lives on foreign soil. 13 more made that same sacrifice just 2 weeks ago during the evacuation of Kabul airport. On 9/11, 412 of the nearly 3,000 victims were firemen, EMTs, and police officers. Hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens today serve in law enforcement and as first responders. And they still serve at great personal risk. 39 law enforcement officers have been shot and killed this year alone. Now, neither soldiers nor first responders sign up and show up for work at every shift because they expect to be thanked. But I think it's appropriate, especially at a moment like this, to remember their sacrifice and to thank others for their continued service. So whether you're watching online or if you're here in this room, if you have served in the military or aspire to, if you serve in the law enforcement or fire services or EMTs, thank you. So this is sort of a turning point in our commemoration today. We move from memory and lament and also the hope of the gospel to a different portion where we're going to learn. CCU is a university, this makes sense. And so the second half is much more focused on education. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Kiron Skinner is a professor of international relations and politics at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. She's been a fellow at the prestigious Hoover Institution of Stanford University and has served on numerous government oversight boards, including the also very prestigious Defense Policy Board for multiple terms. She's an expert on the impact of technology on national security and is the author or editor of 7 books, 2 of which were New York Times bestsellers. from September 2018 to August 2019, Dr. Skinner served as Director of Policy Planning and Senior Advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the U.S. Department of State, providing essential long-term, high-level guidance and competitive thinking. So her position there gives her unique insights into the Afghan war and America's role in the world. Dr. Skinner holds MA and PhD degrees in political science from Harvard University and undergraduate degrees from Spelman College and Sacramento City College. Will you join me in welcoming Dr. Kiron Skinner?
Thank you. On September 10th, 2001, Americans woke up to the full glory of God on this land. It was a beautiful day, and the tension that's defined our nation from its founding was in full display. Americans love peace, but sometimes the requirement of peace includes war. The peace side seemed to be dominating. There was no worry about an adversary or an enemy attacking our land. 24 hours later, it was a very different world. I'd like to talk with you today about how we got to 9/11 and where we are 20 years later. I've listened to the speeches that have been given so far, and they've actually said much of what I'd like to say. So I'll try to give a more historical perspective. But first of all, I have to thank President Sweeting, Professor Copeland, Ms. Urker, and Mr. Lucas for inviting me to join you and accepting the fact that I couldn't be there with you in person and providing all the logistical support to make this happen. I also would like to thank the Western Conservative Summit and the university more broadly, its community of donors, supporters, students, and staff, along with faculty for honoring our nation with this amazingly moving service today. And I think it's actually more of a service than anything else. And I've benefited so much from it in the few minutes that we've been together. But let's go back to the 1930s. It was during that time, that very dark chapter for not just the United States, but for the world, a global depression, the march of fascism, the rise of Nazism. And in the United States, Americans were debating the looming war that they knew was coming. And the largest anti-interventionist or anti-war movement to that point in US history arose in what was called the America First Committee. And despite the way it's been described, it was a completely interesting community of Americans from different sectors of society. African Americans, Jewish Americans, Charles Lindbergh, of course, but a diverse group of Americans were debating whether we should become involved in European politics. And in their view, the United States should listen to what our first president said in his farewell address, stay out of entangling alliances. Other Americans wanted the US to intervene, and they formed organizations and interventionist groups as well. But while we were debating the tension between peace and the military side that's often necessary to maintain peace and democracy, the march of totalitarianism was taking place. Italy invaded Ethiopia. The Spanish Civil War took place. Japan invaded Manchuria. And Americans basically stood by. And then Pearl Harbor happened. And those who were against, those perhaps millions of Americans, of becoming involved yet again in a European war, went straight to the fight and fought for freedom in a way that the world has never seen. Of course, we had partners, European partners, including the Soviets, But the United States was a critical factor in defeating fascism, totalitarianism, racism, Nazism, and advancing peace. And at the same time that we were doing all of that, we were working at a diplomatic fervor to create a liberal international order that the world had never seen. It was even before the US entered World War II, earlier in 1941, when FDR and Churchill met to map out what the post-war world would look like, the Atlantic Charter. And then we went on to create, after the war, the United Nations. We went on to create the Bretton Woods economic system. We lifted millions of people in our own country and around the world out of poverty. We pointed the way to freedom, social justice. We resolved many of our own problems around race and civil rights and discrimination, and became a beacon of hope for the rest of the world. So then you ask a nation that did all of that and ultimately defeated communism, how could 9/11 have happened? Why did they so dislike us? I remember that question being asked. I was teaching a class in international relations at Carnegie Mellon as the towers were being attacked. And the immediate question is, why us? What have we done wrong? We're not a perfect nation. We're not a perfect people. Only God is perfect. But we were operating as much as possible, as much as any nation on earth, in his likeness and in his requirements of what man should do. More people then and more people now want to come into the United States at all cost, legally or illegally, because of the hope of who we are and the promise that the United States brings. So something happened in those years, in the 40s and 50s, when we were remaking the world in a more just order, and 9/11. And I think it was part of who we are to not even see it coming, because on September 10th, we woke up to God's full glory. And on September 11th, we saw what evil could do. We didn't really see what had been coming for decades, that as we were so consumed with the fight against the Soviet Union in this very long, multi-decade Cold War, that the gathering storm of radical Islam was also on the march and would be the force of the future that we would have to address. And you know, it started in the middle of the Cold War, in fact. You go back to the October War of 1973. So unprepared was the United States for any major conflict in the Middle East that we basically had to go into nuclear alert during that conflict. We had almost no forward military presence in that part of the world. We had no military command devoted to the Middle East. European Command, Pacific Command, sometimes we would divide up the Middle East between commands that didn't really want to own it. And then a few years later, the Iranian Revolution happened. And instead of understanding that it and the hostage crisis, which really prefigured much of the world that we're in today, instead of understanding that something fundamentally different was happening, Americans who always want peace, who don't want war, who are not warlike, who think the best of people as much as possible, we didn't see that this was a fundamental shift in the international system. But we began to act that way. So by 1983, we stood up a military command for the Middle East, Central Command. A few years later, 1987, we started Special Operations Command, again organized in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and the skirmishes that we felt and fought in the Persian Gulf with Iran. And then there was the long Iran-Iraq War. Something different than the Cold War was happening, but we stayed on our course to defeat communism. And that happened. And by the end of the 20th century, the color revolutions around the world had led, as Ronald Reagan talked about as he walked away from Washington in January 1989. There's an outbreak of peace. There are more democracies around the world, he stated, than when he started office in 1981. In Central America, in Eastern Europe, even on the African continent, we were seeing a democratic peace dividend as communism failed. But this gathering storm of radical Islam continued, and we got to 9/11. And we were so unprepared for what we were facing, despite the fact that we'd set up military commands, despite the fact that there was a growing discussion in the halls of the State Department about terrorism and even radical Islam. But Americans have a blind spot, and that blind spot is freedom, and that blind spot is peace. And so when we're confronted with forces against us, it takes us time. And the past 20 years, often in the dark, we've stumbled around trying to figure out about this metastasizing threat that exists in the world with non-state actors, with those who want to destroy the Western way of life. And as President Sweeting said, there was no end of history. We thought the liberal order was all in place. Many Americans in the late 1990s. And another storm, another world was developing. And so we better understand today than I think at any point in our history that the price of freedom is a fight one generation at a time, never guaranteed, and that our strongest assets are not our military, but our belief system, our commitment to freedom, our commitment to individual rights, our commitment to religious liberty. And to me, in the past 20 years, despite all of the negative things that have been said about the United States, the fact that more Middle East wars became important for us, the fact that we got into nation building when we said we would not, despite the fact that we have so many fallen heroes that we have to, that we must take care of their memory and take care of their families, something else was going on as well. We increased our commitment to freedom. Religious liberty became a bigger part of our foreign policy toolkit. No matter what you may say about Donald Trump and his presidency, religious liberty was a major part of how he saw the world and what he pressed for in international forums. And no matter what you may say about our failure in nation building, it was our commitment to humanitarianism, our commitment to global philanthropy that brought millions of women and girls and oppressed people to a better place. And they look at the world now and they will fight and they will change their nations and they will join with us. All of these building blocks happened in the past 20 years. You won't hear them from cable news pundits who want to say it's all our fault. We didn't understand the shifts that were happening. Sure enough, we didn't. Who could anticipate all of this? There was a gathering storm, but we still believed in the righteousness of the position that we held in the world, and the world still looks to us. And so we got ourselves to 9/11. We survived this past 20 years. We have a lot of work to do still, but we've been doing that work. And that's what I want the young people here today to realize, that in the 2 decades that you've been growing up, we've recommitted ourselves to freedom. We developed new institutions to address the changing global order. The Department of Homeland Security grew out of the 9/11 Commission. We have new bureaus and agencies within bureaus and departments that address the global war on terror. But we have to worry and this is your particular charge, that we don't let new blind spots catch us off guard, that we get ahead of them, that we see clearer, that we don't make the same mistakes. And if I may add, I think perhaps one of our blind spots now, and it seems to be a bipartisan one, they tend always to be that way, is this idea that China is our big threat and that it's okay to bash the Chinese rhetorically and in policy to score very minor points. I don't think so. I think our gathering storm is actually ourselves. If we don't stay true to our values, those ideas, the ideals that made us Americans in the first place, if we don't increase the coalition of Americans that find themselves in the center of the freedom debate, if we don't really do the hard work that our founding fathers were unable to do, but expected we would do, we don't win the future. But if we do those things, I think there are no blind spots. There is no competition with China. The Biden administration has said there's a competition between the democratic order and the Chinese and totalitarian systems of government. I think there will be no contest if we're better at who we are. And I think, in fact, if we do have a blind spot, it's not about China, but it's about the rising power of the global South, those nations that we need to persuade to join with us in the larger freedom project and not go the easy way out of an authoritarian system. So if we really fix ourselves, I think we fix the world. And that's my message to you on September 10th, 2021. Let's have a conversation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Skinner, for those remarks. We're going to turn to a time of Q&A, and we have two of the student staff from Centennial Institute who are here with microphones. So if you'll raise a hand, I'll direct them to you, and so please use the microphone for your questions. Yes, go ahead.
It sounds like you stated that communist China is not America's greatest threat. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? In my view, they are definitely the greatest threat to the United States and to freedom around the world.
Working on it.
Put differently, the growing consensus. We always have external challengers, but China is not a country where most people want to move to. It's the United States. It's still our way of life with all our flaws and all of our problems. And the Chinese are having a difficult time persuading people that their command economic and political economy is superior to a system of free markets and political, religious, and other economic freedoms. I don't see the contest at the level of ideas. They're having some successes around the world, but when you look just beneath the surface, Belt and Road is a debt trap system for countries that are waking up to what's happening to them. And I always think for the United States, what makes us win in global contest is when we are our best selves. We can't let the competition with China make us less free. We can't let the competition with China make us divided as a people. And I think the Chinese know that who we are, the world's most fully functioning multi-ethnic democracy, is something the world hasn't seen and will work and has worked and continues to survive through some of the most difficult challenges like 9/11 that we face. Also, point two, one of the best ways that we can, quote unquote, defeat China in a global contest is by increasing the zone of states that work with us among the rising powers. I'm speaking of India, Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa. If we don't have these countries on our side, we don't prevail in the long run. But if we do, there's almost no contest from the Chinese.
More questions? Yes, come on down.
Hi, my name is Greg Moore. I teach here at CCU, and I just moved back from China after 10 years in China, and I'll self-identify as an ultra hawk on China. And when you first said that about a grave threat, I was thinking, I don't think I disagree, but actually I will conclude that I do agree with what she said, and partially, joining that conversation with what you were raising. If we want to look at a country around the world or a force out there that's the gravest threat, I would say probably China is that. But I think Professor Skinner, you're absolutely right, that we are the biggest danger to ourselves because we are so divided right now, and so many people are forgetting what this has all been about for 200 years. And I really just want to support what you said. I think if we can kind of get our act together and come together and stop demonizing the other, as we're good and they're evil. The Bible doesn't say we're good and they're evil. The Bible says we're all evil and we're all broken. And if we can just remember some of those basic both sides, D and R, I think there's no stopping the continued rise and continued improvement and continued bright future of this great country. And I think if we get that together, there's no stopping us. And China has nothing to offer the world that can compete with what we've been doing successfully in the 20th century and up until now. If we don't get it together and we continue to be divided and attacking each other and not solving some of our problems at home, I do think China will just step into the void. And that's what they've been doing the last decade or so. So thank you for those comments. Yeah.
If I could respond before the next question, I have to say, you said it better than I could say it, and I think it's in my reading of what's happening, it's true. I always get a bit concerned and suspicious when political elites in Washington actually start having a consensus on with easy sound bites. Now it's China, because we miss a lot. And I think the future of the international system and our role as a predominant power on earth is more about the nuance of what's happening than the easy soundbite. Sure, the Chinese are the biggest trading partner of almost every Asian economy. Sure, the Chinese have, created a security belt in the South China Sea. We can point to all of these things, but many countries in the world look to us for who we are. And that's the strongest counter. I've already talked about the debt trap that it creates. But if we take a lesson from the 20th century, is that we poured enormous energy, innovation, and creativity into creating the liberal economic order and being incredibly generous through the Marshall Plan and many Marshall Plans all over the world. But we focused so much on the Soviet Union and its particular challenge that for a couple of decades, we missed in the 20th century what was the challenge coming next. I don't want us to do that with China, focus so much on one country, the easy target, and not realize that the global South, what it does, will affect what both the US and the Chinese ultimately do, and whether one side or the other is the predominant power.
Yes, we have a question down front.
I don't want to sound divisive. The sense of unity has been underlying much of what's been said today. But I am horror-stricken by much of what's going on in this country right now. 1619 Project, the New York Times. Our history is all slavery. That's what we've always been about. The foundation that they actually used, referring to the founders, that this was a corrupt mythology, a corrupt myth. There are people out there right now who preach hate for America, essentially. They don't think we begin to measure up to other countries around the world. Europe's so much better. After all, they're more socialistic. Religion is not growing now. It's declining. People going to church are declining. The numbers are going down all the time. It's harder and harder to find ministers for churches. Postmodernism mentioned earlier, and critical theory, critical race theory. There's no truth anymore. No truth, no objectivity. This is all out the window. It's gone. It's a critical theory, by the way, has Marxist roots and post-structural, and it has an interesting, and postmodernism, interesting theories, but they essentially just throw truth out the window.
Sorry, is there a question for Dr. Skinner?
Yes. Cancel culture, law and order is going on. Disrespect for the flag. It was so nice today to hear the Star-Spangled Banner and everybody standing up, and so many having there. So what is this issue? Is this something that we need? Are we getting stronger or are we getting weaker? Are we getting more unified or are we getting more divisive? Do we have the same values we used to have, or are our values changing?
Great question, and it's a huge question, and I'll try to do as much with it in the time that I have. We started with attention. If you read, we often teach the Federalist Papers, but we also should read the Anti-Federalist Papers. And we look at our earliest history. Our nation is one that's been about a fundamental tension in the broad community of ideas. There were always people who didn't want limited government, who didn't want us to have democracy and freedom. Our earliest, and I think this is where Mark Levin's new book on American Marxism is something that I recommend to all of you. We have been fighting attention for a long time, but for most of our history, the freedom side won out. But it doesn't mean that other isms have been completely defeated, like socialism, like Marxism. I don't think they ever go away in our country. I think we're in a period now where the contest is clearer, perhaps, than it's been in a very long time, partly due to social media, technology, the immediacy of every single event in the world. But I wouldn't count Americans out. And I think the reason that I say this is that although for the most part, the academy, and I think that's what you've been speaking about, and not just universities and colleges, but K through 12, I like to say K through 16, have been largely hijacked by the progressive agenda. There are really strong indications of hope. I see Colorado Christian University as one. I'm on the board of Grove City College outside of Pittsburgh. It took a case to the Supreme Court a couple of decades ago so that it would not have to take federal funding. There are other colleges like it as well, Hillsdale College. There are many, many others. And I think that there is a move now among these institutions to fill in the void where progressive education has tried to snatch complete control. And for the first time, Americans who aren't involved in as educators are awake to the fact we have to fight against progressive education. And that wasn't the case a few years ago. Even 24 months ago, maybe 12 months ago, most Americans had not heard of CRT. And now they have. And many parents are asking, do I pay $40,000 or $50,000 a year for tuition for every other class my child takes to be infused with critical race theory, progressive thought? I just think we see there's an emerging movement in this country to fight back. And Donald Trump took on as president the 1619 Project. That was a fundamental theoretical moment, I think, for the debate in this country against progressive ideas, to have a US president to use the vocabulary and to really attempt to make a different argument. That momentum hasn't stopped. Everywhere I go in the country, I see people more eager, more excited to defend the values that we actually hold, knowing that the United States is a complex set of ideas, and one side will never be able to have its complete way. And that includes socialism. I just don't see it prevailing.
Another question in the back? Yeah.
Hey, ma'am, Clint Doris, a senior leader at the Department of Defense. So certainly recognize where you're headed with kind of the theory here. China absolutely is certainly I don't even let my guys say near peer anymore. It's a peer adversary for sure. But I think since you have this great captive audience of young people, right, of youth, and you mentioned earlier about maybe kind of we're our own worst enemy, in my words, right? It would be fantastic in my mind, as I've got my two young boys here, if you will, what some very practical and specific things are that you're referencing, right? And what the youth of our nation can do in whether that's positive things or resisting particular messages. I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you for asking about what young people can do. And I tell my students all the time, get ready. You're going to be taking over faster than you think. Many of the adults have blown it so much that they are going to be forced off stage before they thought they would be. And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I actually do mean it. And I think that there are things that we can do, that we are doing, that that Colorado Christian University is in fact doing. I think a recommitment to understanding Western values, teaching Western civilization, teaching great books, but expanding the canon is really critical. You cannot arrive in the Oval Office and defend the West if you don't even know what the West is. You cannot defend free markets if you haven't been taught basic economics. I think going back to the intellectual basics and having events like today are so critical for the future of our country. They may not seem like it for many, and it seems distant to be reading a great book, studying the West, taking a course in Western civilization, reassessing the canon, and then ultimately saving America. But I think that's the fastest way. When people ask me, and because I have almost 20 years experience in the Defense Department on numerous national security boards in the White House as well, what's the biggest national security threat? I say it's right at home, and it's K through 16. And if we fix that, we not only save our country, but we enhance freedom around the world. So I think it's the kind of education that we have. And one of the positive effects of 9/11 domestically was that we began to study foreign languages and cultures more than we ever had. And that was more Arabic language speakers in the US, Farsi, Dari, and I think we began Arabic. We began to do more of this. Hebrew, we just expanded our language offerings at universities and colleges. I think that's critical because some things don't happen in the translation, and you have to understand a people in their own terms. It's really revising the curriculum as much as possible. And that right now is going to happen on academic outposts, on colleges and universities that haven't been seen as the most elite in the past, that have the largest endowments. I think that's changing. I think donors or philanthropists are becoming a lot more strategic, and understanding that if they want freedom to prevail, they've got to endow and support the places that are committed to advancing freedom. And I think that's your college, your university, and I believe it will happen in bigger numbers.
The question down front, go ahead.
Dr. Skinner, this is Jeff Hunt. You've had a front row seat in shaping U.S. policy as it relates to Afghanistan, serving Secretary Pompeo and serving in the State Department. Can you talk about some of the conversations you all had, the planning, the ideas with regards to how the U.S. was going to withdraw from Afghanistan, what happened under the Biden administration, and where you think this is going to go in the future?
About 5 questions all in one. I'll say one of the I think the regrets I have from the Trump administration is that as the State Department under Pompeo set up a system of envoys, one for Afghanistan, one for Venezuela, one for Iran, and hotspots around the world, one for Syria. The full talent of the interagency and even within the State Department wasn't used because the envoys reported directly to the secretary, and they had very, very small staffs. And often what they were doing was close hold. So others of us in leadership weren't part of that conversation. I think problems like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan needed better vetting through the interagency, more discussion, not less, more alternative hypotheses and rival hypotheses, not less. And that actually didn't happen as much as I would like to have seen it happen. I believe President Trump would have appreciated it. I think he had some real reservations about the Taliban deal that was signed out of the State Department. And that's a function of what happens in government and the way things are set up. I don't think anyone was prepared for a perfect or even really safe exit from Afghanistan, but all the signals from the American public and from many others as well in civil society suggested that it was time to go. But still many others said we needed more time. I think the answer is somewhere in between. And I believe that this administration wanted to honor that campaign pledge, that point of view that had been part of what President Biden had advocated while the VP for President Obama, and they went forward without looking down the game tree completely to see what that would mean. Some of it now in just immediate retrospect seems unbelievable that you don't take out your diplomats and civilians before the military, that you close down Bagram Air Base, that you don't have all of the things in place that we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks. But I think the overall commitment was trying to channel and reflect what the American people wanted. It would have taken enormous courage and clarity of thought to slow down the machine of let's get out of Afghanistan and put in place the kind of withdrawal that would have been so much superior and led to no loss of life. And I just don't think that the will, the commitment, and the courage exist right now among many of our leaders to really talk to the American public and explain what the requirements are, what we need to do, why we need to take a course that looks like we may be there longer than they want. But this will ultimately serve our objectives. That just didn't happen. This has been a bipartisan problem across 4 presidencies. No one had it right. This was really difficult and still is. Where do we go now in Afghanistan? The whole idea of working with the Taliban is so unimaginable for many of us who've been in this business for a long time. Someone asked me on air, I'm a Fox contributor, the other day, should we meet with the Taliban at the United Nations? I said, absolutely not. We've got to focus on not only getting our people out, securing our interests, getting, the kind of forward basing rights that we may need in the region. And I can't even begin to think about meetings with the Taliban. That's something, if I served in government right now, I would not do.
Well, let's take one more question from one of our students down front here.
My name is Marissa Archuleta, and I'm a history major, and I have a follow-up to Mr. Hunt's question. It was, has the Afghanistan pullout basically put us back where we were in 2001, and has everything been in vain that we have done in Afghanistan for the past 20 years?
I would say no, and what we did was not in vain. I think the reason I talked about the 1930s and the run-up to World War II was that Americans are slow to anger. Americans are slow to war. Americans want and believe in peace as a dominant force in the way we look at our role in the world. And when we finally act, we act decisively and we act in our interest. I think we did that post 9/11. In the weeks ahead where we prepared to go into Afghanistan. I was on Don Rumsfeld's Defense Policy Board at that time. Our first meeting was about 10 or 12 days after 9/11, and the building still smelled of smoke when we arrived. And I saw the deliberations, participated in some, the commitment to our country. I don't think it was in vain. We lost some lives the other day, the Marines, and that's incredibly tragic and hurtful. And my students were just despondent that day when we learned of it, as I know that you were and still are. But we did advance the Freedom Project. And that sounds so counterintuitive with the Taliban coming to power. I think we unleashed something in the broader Middle East through our humanitarian efforts, perhaps our failed nation building efforts, whatever you want to call it, around the position of women and girls and freedom, and it's not going away. And that is important to understand. I also believe that even though many say, well, Afghanistan's now a new safe haven for Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, all these other terrorists and jihadists around the world, it will be hard. It will be hard for it to be that bastion of jihadist extremist behavior, because every country that thought they would benefit from a U.S. withdrawal, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Pakistanians, now have new troubles. And those troubles are real. Refugee crises, activating the militants in their own countries, and some of the others, Muslim groups who are against their government, the Uyghurs in China, for the Russians, the problem of activating the Central Asians, certain forces there, for Pakistan, the Pakistan Taliban. This is not an easy situation for them. And so it isn't a zero-sum game that we lost, they win. I think that we pushed this country, known as the graveyard of empires, as much as any other great power has ever attempted to do.
Well, thank you, Dr. Skinner, for your extraordinary insights that you've shared with us today. So will you join me in thanking Dr. Skinner?
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you again for joining us today for this commemoration of 9/11. I want to thank all those who have participated, including Professor McNeil and the choir, President Sweeting, Professor Spear, and Dr. Skinner. As you go, we'd like to invite you to go across campus to the lawn of Loprino Hall, where we have a display of nearly 3,000 American flags, placed by CCU students as a walk-through memorial. It is a vivid visual reminder of the lives lost on 9/11. I'd like to close with a couple of words from the historian Wilfred McClay about the importance of memory. He says, historical consciousness is to civilized society what memory is to individual identity. One cannot say who or what one is. One can't say one is anyone or anything at all without some selective retention of experience and source of continuity. One cannot learn, use language, pass on knowledge, raise offspring, or even dwell in society without the aid of memory. Without memory, there are no workable rules of conduct, no standard of justice, no basis for restraining passions, no sense of the connection between an action and its consequences. There can be no sense of the future as a moment in time we know will come because we remember that other tomorrows have come too. And there can be no recognition of the sacred, no act of consecration or devotion to the unseen, for nothing exists but the proximate and the sensate. In the end, communities and nation states are constituted and sustained by shared memories, by stories of foundation, conflict, and perseverance. The leap of imagination and faith from the thinness and unreliability of our individual memory to the richness of collective memory, that is the leap of civilized life. And the discipline of collective memory is the task not only of the historian, but of every one of us. Historical consciousness draws us out of a narrow preoccupation with the present and with ourselves and ushers us into another larger world, a public world that cultures us in all the senses of that word. So as we collectively remember those who died, those who survived, and those who have and continue to serve, I leave you with a simple charge: to remember and to hope in the one sovereign God of the universe. In that light, I'd like to ask the Peak Harmony Vocal Ensemble to close our event by singing the hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." If you don't know the story behind this hymn, I encourage you to look it up. Thank you, singers. Thank you. We're dismissed.